Let's begin in the early Georgian streets of London, where a drizzle meant more than damp clothing. It could mean social condemnation. In the early 18th century, umbrellas were considered suspicious, foreign contraptions, oddities carried by eccentric foreigners, mostly from the East. They weren't symbols of status, protection, or practicality. Quite the opposite. To many Englishmen, particularly in London, carrying an umbrella was not only unfashionable, it was a mild act of social rebellion. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Imagine it. You're strolling down Fleet Street in the year 1752. The skis are brooding and the first cold drops of rain begin to fall. Everyone around you picks up their pace. Some dash beneath awnings, others tug their cloaks tightly. Carriages rattle past and footmen raise large waxed hats to shield their masters, but no umbrellas appear. That's because in Britain, especially among the upper classes, umbrellas were still associated with weakness, vanity, and a kind of unmanly fastidiousness. They were thought to be things women or foreign priests might carry, not something a proper English gentleman would be seen using. Rain, after all, was considered part of life. To show concern about it was to reveal a lack of stoic British character. You might have seen a rare figure on that street, however, a peculiar man named Jonas Hanway. A philanthropist, writer, and traveler, Hanway was among the first Britons to adopt the umbrella as part of his daily attire. Inspired by his years in Persia, where parasols had long been a sign of status and practical utility, Hanway returned to London, and much to the amusement and scorn of onlookers, began carrying an umbrella regularly in the 1750s. He endured jeers. Some accounts describe how coachmen would pelt him with mud or follow him through the streets shouting insults. Cab drivers, especially, saw umbrellas as a threat to their income. If people began using them during rainstorms, they'd have fewer passengers, and so they made life difficult for early adopters. This curious tension between utility and social perception lay at the heart of the umbrella's slow rise in British fashion. For decades, umbrellas remained trapped in a curious purgatory, too practical to ignore, yet too taboo for widespread use. Umbrellas at this time weren't even particularly convenient. Early models were clumsy and heavy, made of whalebone or cane ribs and covered in oiled silk. They weren't collapsible. There was no sleek folding mechanism. To carry one was to lug a long, awkward pole everywhere you went, a minor burden, made all the worse by the attention it drew. Despite this, the number of umbrella carriers slowly began to grow. Tradespeople and lower-class workers, less beholden to the upper-class standards of stoicism, began to adopt them out of necessity. London, after all, was wet. On average, it rained over 100 days a year. For those who walked to work or hawked goods in the street, an umbrella was less a fashion statement and more a survival tool. But the tipping point, if such a quiet, boring revolution can have a tipping point, didn't come from the nobility or even the merchants. It came from shopkeepers and pedestrian women. By the turn of the 19th century, the umbrella began to appear in shop displays as something both elegant and practical. Manufacturers such as James Smith and Sons, still in business today, began advertising umbrellas with ornate handles, colorful fabrics, and more manageable sizes. These changes didn't happen overnight, but rather through years of tiny iterations. The bones got lighter, the handles curved more ergonomically, and the stigma, slowly, drop by drop, it began to wash away. Interestingly, the church played a minor role in this transformation. As umbrellas began to appear in congregations held by those waiting outside in the rain, clergy members at first viewed them with skepticism. Some sermons denounced them as symbols of vanity, yet others quietly adopted them. Still, resistance lingered. Even by 1810, umbrellas were often mocked in caricatures and satirical prints. Artists like George Cruikshank portrayed umbrella carriers as dandies preening, impractical figures too delicate for real life. But in satire, there's acknowledgement. And by lampooning umbrella carriers, society was admitting their presence. We should pause here and note the cultural import of something so seemingly dull. The umbrella is not merely an object. It is a barometer of social change. Its gradual acceptance maps onto shifts in class structure, transportation habits, urban design, and even gender politics. The fact that ordinary working women were among the first to carry umbrellas in daily life speaks volumes about practicality trumping prestige. By the 1820s, the umbrella was on the verge of becoming a normalized accessory in British urban life. Yet acceptance didn't mean equality. As more people carried umbrellas, the object itself became stratified. A poor tradesman might carry a plain black model with a wooden shaft. A wealthy lady might have one trimmed with lace, painted with floral patterns, or imported from France. The umbrella, like clothing, became a way to signal class, ironically reintroducing vanity into a tool, initially rejected for being too vain. So, how did the umbrella finally cross the threshold into respectable society? What role did industrialization, weather forecasting, and social mobility play in this slow-motion rebellion? And perhaps more curiously, when and why did it start falling back out of fashion? As the clatter of horse-drawn carriages echoed through the increasingly crowded streets of 19th-century London, the umbrella once ridiculed had found its foothold. But acceptance didn't mean simplicity. Instead, as with many objects that transition from novelty to necessity, the umbrella splintered into a constellation of meanings. What had once been a rare, even rebellious item was now a potent social signifier. Let us first consider the changing city. London in the 1820s and 1830s was dirty. Really, truly dirty. The kind of soot and mud that clung to boots and skin in thick layers also soaked into clothing and hair. Industrial coal smoke blackened the air, and rain only helped it stick. In this atmosphere, the umbrella evolved from a peculiar eccentricity into a genuine necessity. And so, a new industry quietly began to bloom. One of the earliest signs of this shift was the emergence of umbrella-specific shops. James Smith and Sons, founded in 1830, opened a shop on New Oxford Street that would become iconic for its dedication to umbrellas alone. Their storefront windows displayed rows of parasols, walking sticks, and rain protectors in every imaginable shape and size. The umbrella had begun its slow drift into the mainstream, and capitalism was happy to welcome it. This was also the era when umbrellas began to be gendered more explicitly. Women's umbrellas became smaller, daintier, and often more decorative, carrying hints of the parasol tradition. Men's umbrellas were longer, darker, and stiffer, symbolic of a growing connection between male dress and stoic uniformity. In Victorian society, fashion was not merely for appearance, it was an architecture of meaning. But let's linger a moment on something seemingly dull, the umbrella handle. Early 19th century umbrellas still used wood and whalebone in their ribs, but it was the handle that drew attention. Ivory, silver, bone, horn, and eventually celluloid were all employed to craft curved or straight handles. For many, the handle wasn't just a grip, it was a silent statement of status. Walking down the Strand with a carved ivory umbrella handle was equivalent to wearing a pocket watch or silk cravat. Yet the innovation that truly democratized the umbrella came from an unlikely corner: mechanics. In 1852, Samuel Fox, an engineer from Sheffield, developed what he called the Paragon frame, using steel ribs instead of whalebone. This was a quiet revolution. Steel was not only stronger but also lighter, and more importantly, it enabled the umbrella to fold more efficiently. Before this, umbrellas were stiff, cumbersome tools. Fox's design allowed for a more collapsible, portable item that could be tucked under one's arm or hung by a door. The innovation spread rapidly. By the 1860s, the majority of umbrellas sold in Britain incorporated Fox's steel-ribbed design. Interestingly, this engineering feat wasn't initially embraced as fashion. Much like Hanway's first public forays with umbrellas a century earlier, the new collapsible umbrella was mocked. Early adopters were seen as gimmicky or overly concerned with convenience. But as always, practicality won. As the middle class expanded and more people commuted by foot, train, or tram, the need for portable personal rain protection only grew. Soon, the collapsible umbrella was no longer a novelty, it was a necessity. But necessity brought with it new tensions. As umbrellas became ubiquitous, they also became associated with certain behavioral expectations. Proper umbrella etiquette was published in newspapers and etiquette books. One should not open an umbrella indoors, not for superstitious reasons, but because it was considered discourteous and disruptive. In a crowded street, gentlemen were expected to tilt their umbrellas away from others, never letting water drip on a passerby. Umbrella collision became a frequent source of mild social friction. In fact, so frequent were these altercations that letters to the Times in the 1870s and 1880s began appearing from irritated pedestrians complaining of umbrella wars. Some even proposed umbrella licenses for crowded city centers. Others mocked the sudden rise in what one columnist called umbrella dueling, a reference to accidental pokes and jabs, as people hurried through rainy alleys and shopping arcades. Still, behind these comedic anecdotes lay deeper truths about how public space was negotiated in Victorian cities. The umbrella wasn't just a weather tool, it was a space-claiming device. To carry one was to assert a small personal domain in the crowd. It altered the way people walked, moved, and interacted. Umbrellas also began to appear in unexpected cultural and political contexts. For example, Prime Minister William Gladstone was known for carrying a large black umbrella. He once famously used it to push back a heckler during a political appearance, and for decades afterward, the image of the ministerial umbrella became part of the public imagination. It represented conservative respectability, liberal progress, or, depending on the cartoonist, laughable self-importance. Meanwhile, as the empire expanded, British travelers took umbrellas abroad, where they often served dual purposes: protection from rain and sun, and a subtle mark of British civility. There are numerous colonial-era photographs of administrators and officers posing with umbrellas standing stiffly, often beneath a tropical sun. The object had come full circle, born from foreign traditions, mocked at home, and now used abroad as a symbol of British authority. At home, though, umbrellas still remained quietly divisive. Working-class families often shared a single umbrella among many children. Some schoolboys were beaten for losing the family umbrella. For a poor household, it was an investment, something kept in the hallway closet and brought out only when truly necessary. Raincoats were cheaper, hats more replaceable. By the 1870s, department stores such as Harrods and Selfridges began offering umbrellas in hundreds of styles. Some were collapsible. Others included secret compartments for love notes or coins. Umbrella theft became common enough that one could purchase umbrella locks. And yet, in all of this evolution, the umbrella had also become strangely invisible. Its slow rise had led to its quiet normalization. What was once the center of debate, satire, and controversy now hung unnoticed on coat racks or dripped quietly in entryways. The revolution was complete. The rebellion had ended. The umbrella was no longer interesting. But therein lies the odd twist. Because as the umbrella became invisible, its cultural weight began to fade. It was no longer a symbol of defiance or refinement. It was just there. So what happened next? How did the umbrella's reign quietly slip away? And what does the story of its fall say about our modern relationship to fashion, utility, and forgotten tools? By the late 19th century, the umbrella had achieved total integration into British urban life. It hung on hallway pegs in row houses, stood ready behind shop counters, and accompanied nearly every businessman commuting through foggy London mornings. But in its very ubiquity lay the seeds of its quiet demise, not of function, but of fascination. The umbrella, now firmly normalized, lost its novelty. What had once been a cultural marker of defiance, class, or refinement gradually faded into the background of daily life. By the 1880s, it was as common as the pocket handkerchief or the humble button. And much like these once revolutionary accessories, its meaning dulled over time. It was no longer a symbol, it was just expected. Still, there remained a final golden age, a lingering glimmer of elegance that clung to the umbrella well into the Edwardian period. This was the era of matched accessories. A gentleman's coat, gloves, hat, and umbrella were expected to coordinate in style and shade. Black silk umbrellas with carved silver or ivory handles became staples of the well-dressed urban man. For women, the divide between parasols, sun protection, and umbrellas, rain protection, became more pronounced, with each possessing its own strict rules of design and use. Paradoxically, this division hastened the umbrella's eventual decline in fashionable circles. As parasols became increasingly associated with older forms of femininity, delicacy, fragility, and domesticity, they fell out of favor with modern women. Umbrellas, while more practical, were too neutral to make a fashion statement, and so they simply existed. The world, however, was changing. The 20th century introduced a new kind of chaos: industrial war, global conflict, and urban transformation. During the First World War, umbrellas were almost completely absent from military life. Trenches had no place for silk canopies or carved handles. Utility ruled. Rain was endured, not deflected. When soldiers returned home, they brought with them a new relationship to weather, clothing, and class. Simplicity was no longer a virtue, it was a necessity. And while the umbrella remained in civilian life, its aura was further diminished. Even language began to change. The once distinct terms bumbershoot, a humorous, vaguely American invention, and gamp, a reference to the umbrella-wielding Mrs. Gamp from Dickens' Martin Chuzzlewit, faded from everyday use. In fact, by the 1920s, the umbrella no longer had cultural nicknames. It had become too mundane to need them. A significant blow to the umbrella's status came with the rise of mechanized transportation. With the advent of omnibuses, trams, and private automobiles, fewer people walked long distances in the rain. The short journey from doorstep to carriage was now measured in seconds. Raincoats, waterproof caps, and enclosed vehicles made umbrellas redundant in many urban settings. This wasn't immediate, of course. In rural areas and among the working class, umbrellas remained essential. But in cities, particularly among the upper and middle classes, the umbrella began to feel almost performative, something one brought out for show more than for necessity. And then came World War II. During the Blitz, rain was no longer the greatest threat from above. Londoners looked skyward not in search of clouds but bombers. The darkness was broken by searchlights, not lightning, and the air was filled with ash, not drizzle. In such an environment, the umbrella was again displaced, not derided, not mocked, but simply forgotten. It was not banned, but it had no place in blackout drills or gas mask kits. Yet, interestingly, it made a symbolic return. Winston Churchill, rarely photographed without his signature black Homburg hat and matching umbrella, became a visual anchor for British resilience. His umbrella was not particularly elegant, nor did it serve a critical function, but it communicated familiarity, a link to the past. In the midst of modern war, it was a relic of gentler civility. And this, perhaps, is the umbrella's most enduring legacy, not as a tool but as a memory. By the 1950s, the world had changed again. Post-war modernism demanded speed, functionality, and clean lines. The umbrella was no longer a gentleman's essential, nor a lady's accessory. It was a convenience item, mass-produced, often plastic, and prone to breaking in strong winds. Disposable. It's telling that as Britain shifted from an empire to a modern state, the umbrella followed a similar path from object of distinction to objective utility. It remained in doorways and glove compartments, but it no longer featured in caricature, politics, or fashion. Children no longer inherited their father's umbrella. Few had ornate handles, even fewer carried monograms, and with collapsible models becoming cheaper and lighter, there was no longer reason to own just one. A lost umbrella wasn't a tragedy. It was barely a bother. But what does the rise and quiet fall of the umbrella really tell us? It reveals, in part, how deeply our tools reflect our values. An umbrella once meant rebellion against class norms. Later, it reflected industrial ingenuity. Still later, it signified social conformity and status. And eventually, it became invisible. The umbrella is not gone, but it is no longer meaningful. Yet perhaps that's precisely why its story matters. We live surrounded by forgotten objects, items that once carried immense cultural weight and now barely draw a second glance. Studying them is not merely nostalgia, it's a form of archaeology, a way to uncover how daily life, social change, and quiet resistance have always shaped our world, not through revolutions, but through the slow, steady patter of rain on silk. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you open an umbrella in the drizzle, you'll wonder, what silent histories are we still carrying, unnoticed, in our hands? Story 2. The Button Boot Debacle, Victorian Engineering in Everyday Footwear. Your feet in the early Victorian era were not simply functional. They were a reflection of your class, your morals, and your willingness to endure discomfort in the name of decency. In a time when propriety reigned supreme and the visible body was a matter of deep concern, few things were as closely scrutinized or as heavily engineered as a person's shoes. Chief among them, the button boot, elegant, restrictive, maddeningly intricate, and yet somehow quietly essential. Let us step back carefully into the first half of the 19th century, when the art of footwear was in a strange transitional state. Before the button boot became common, most shoes and boots were simple lace-ups, buckled shoes, or pull-on boots, relatively similar to those worn in the 18th century. But the Industrial Revolution changed everything. Suddenly, materials could be processed faster, patterns could be replicated with precision, and footwear, once a matter of custom cobbling, could be mass-produced for a swelling urban population. With these advances came innovation, and among the many footwear evolutions of the time, none were quite as frustrating or as oddly revered as the button boot. These boots, popular primarily between the 1830s and the 1910s, were constructed of soft leather or canvas and featured a row of tiny, tightly spaced buttons running up the ankle or calf. They were considered elegant, modest, and appropriate for both women and children, and in later years even some men. But here's the catch: they were almost impossible to put on without help. The Victorian button boot was a masterpiece of impracticality. The buttons were often less than a centimeter across, made of metal, bone, shell, or cloth-covered wood. The buttonholes were reinforced but stiff. To fasten the boot, one had to use a small metal tool called a button hook, a simple device, but a necessity in every well-managed household. The process was slow, laborious. In many ways it was symbolic. To wear button boots was to declare that you had the time and means to wrestle with them. It meant you had leisure. It implied, often subtly, that you had help: a maid, a valet, a patient family member to assist you in dressing. For women in particular, who were already bound by corsets and petticoats, the button boot was another layer of enforced delicacy. It's worth noting that most people didn't put their own shoes on in private, let alone in public. The act of dressing oneself fully was still, in certain circles, considered either juvenile or unfortunate. Servants dressed the wealthy, and even among the middle class, parents dressed children well into adolescence. Clothing was not just apparel, it was infrastructure. So why not just use laces? Laces, ironically, were considered informal, appropriate for work shoes, schoolboys, or lower-class footwear. They were associated with speed and independence, both of which were curiously undesirable in women's fashion. A woman rushing through her morning routine, scandalous. A child putting on their own boots, slightly improper. The button boot, then, was a performance, a slow, deliberate ritual of domestic life, not dissimilar to the long preparation of a Victorian hairstyle or the winding of a pocket watch. And yet the button boot wasn't just a symbol of class and patience. It was also, believe it or not, a marvel of design. Bootmakers spent considerable energy refining the fit and silhouette of these boots. They were often crafted with pointed toes and high arches, designed to elongate the foot and make the ankle appear narrow. Some included contrasting panels of leather and cloth, embroidered detailing, or decorative stitching. And since the boots hugged the ankle tightly, they were often more supportive and long-lasting than many modern shoes. But this perfection came at a cost. Feet in button boots were compressed, misshaped, and in many cases injured. As with corsetry, Victorian footwear paid little attention to the natural form of the human body. Instead, shoes were made symmetrical identical for left and right. Truly foot-specific shoes didn't become common until later in the century. A break-in period was expected, and blisters were normal. Even more curious was the unspoken taboo around the sight of bare feet. Feet were considered semi-private, intimate in a way we might find puzzling today. Stockings were never to be removed casually, and boot removal itself, especially in front of others, was a small ceremony of propriety. In literature and theater, a scene involving a woman removing her boots might be read as subtly provocative. Manufacturers, seizing on the popularity of button boots, developed an entire ecosystem around them. Boot polish, shoe horns, button hooks of every size and design, some simple metal loops, others adorned with ivory handles or family crests. In the wealthiest homes, button hooks were stored in silver grooming sets, displayed like surgical instruments. They also became souvenirs. Tourist shops sold button hooks engraved with names of cities or seaside towns. Children received them as gifts. Some had compartments for smelling salts. Others doubled as paper cutters. All this for a tool whose sole purpose was to coax a tiny button through a stubborn hole. But not everyone could afford such trappings. Among the working classes, button boots were often handed down between siblings, or patched and repaired well beyond their intended lifespan. Cobbler shops became essential neighborhood fixtures. Children were taught to polish and care for the family's few pairs of footwear, a task that took time and care, especially with buttons that had to be reinforced or resewn regularly. This divide between boots worn for labor and boots worn for display grew starker with each passing year. While shop girls and governesses might wear plain black button boots, the upper class experimented with French styles, heeled variants, and button boots dyed to match gowns or outerwear. And yet the technology behind the button boot rarely improved. There were minor variations. Some boots used elastic side panels, though these were considered scandalously modern. Others replaced buttons with hooks or snaps, but these remained the exception. Tradition held strong, especially in Britain, where the button boot became as symbolic as the umbrella, a signal of good breeding, proper conduct, and quiet suffering. But as the 1870s approached, signs of change were beginning to appear: small cracks in the buttoned facade. Rubberized shoes were being experimented with. American manufacturers were introducing more practical designs, and a new generation, one increasingly mobile, urban, and impatient, was beginning to question whether every detail of daily dress truly needed to be so time-consuming. So how did the button boot fall out of fashion? What replaced it and why? And what happened to the humble buttonhook, once found in every drawer in the Victorian home? By the final decades of the 19th century, a quiet revolution was walking its way through Victorian society on foot. Though the button boot still reigned in parlors and promenade walks, change was afoot in the streets, on factory floors, and in newly industrialized shopping districts. Innovations in materials, shifts in social structure, and the rising tide of practicality over pageantry began to chip away at the dominance of this once symbolic footwear. Let's begin with the material transformation, rubber. In 1839, Charles Goodyear had famously discovered the vulcanization process, allowing natural rubber to be transformed into a stable, elastic, and waterproof material. By the 1870s, this technology had matured enough to enter mainstream footwear. The result? Rubber galoshes, overshoes, and eventually, rubber-soled boots that were more flexible, weather-resistant, and importantly easier to put on than the ornate buttoned boot. These weren't fashion items at first. In fact, they were largely utilitarian, worn by laborers, delivery men, and anyone who had to work in wet conditions. But they began to catch on. Why? Because they could be slipped on. No button hooks, no stooping, no servants required. This was more than convenience, it was independence. And it was particularly attractive to a growing class of working women, urban professionals, and even schoolchildren who needed to dress themselves quickly and get on with the day. Meanwhile, the global economy was also reshaping footwear. British manufacturers faced stiff competition from American companies like the Boston-based Walkover Shoe Company, which pioneered large-scale factory production of standardized shoes. These companies offered cheaper, ready-to-wear alternatives to traditional British cobblers, who still relied on semi-bespoke construction. In America, laced boots had never fully fallen out of fashion. They were associated with pioneering, practicality, and rugged individualism, a contrast to the British association of laces with low status. As American shoes began to flood British markets, they brought with them different cultural assumptions. Lacing, slowly but surely, was rebranded not as improper, but as efficient. Then there was the growth of the middle class. Rising literacy, industrial wealth, and expanding cities brought millions into new, fast-paced routines. The emphasis was shifting from ritualized dressing to rapid preparation. People wanted to get to work, catch the train, or get the children to school. Buttoning 20 tiny leather-covered nubs each morning felt increasingly like an outdated ceremony, a relic of a slower era. And yet, buttoned boots clung on, especially among the elite. In fact, the 1880s saw a brief resurgence in highly stylized buttoned boots. These were often imported from Paris, made of velvet or silk, dyed in jewel tones, and trimmed with lace or embroidery. Some had decorative rather than functional buttons. Others incorporated clever combinations of laces and buttons, allowing the wearer to appear fashionable while secretly embracing modern ease. But these styles were, ironically, more costume than clothing. They were worn at social events by the fashionable few and often changed multiple times per day to suit an outfit or occasion. The everyday buttoned boot, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly burdensome. Newspapers of the era occasionally featured humorous commentary about button rage, the frustration of dealing with ill-fitting boots or lost button hooks in the morning rush. The London Illustrated News even published a cartoon in 1890, one of a woman in her dressing room, furiously attempting to fasten her boots while a maid kneeled beside her in defeat. The caption, "The battle of the day begins." And there was another factor quietly influencing public taste: sports. The late Victorian era saw the explosion of outdoor activities: bicycling, tennis, walking clubs, and even early women's hiking groups. These pursuits demanded footwear that was flexible, breathable, and above all, manageable. The tightly fitted buttoned boot was simply unsuited to such motion. As a result, laced boots, low-heeled walking shoes, and eventually ankle boots with elastic gussets, made famous by the invention of Goring in the mid-19th century, became increasingly popular among active women. Though initially controversial, some critics saw these boots as mannish. They allowed freedom of movement in a way that buttoned footwear never had. Still, tradition lingered. In formal portraits and fashion plates, buttoned boots retained their place well into the early 1900s. Queen Victoria herself was rarely seen in public without her signature ankle boots, although hers were specially made for comfort rather than aesthetic conformity. But even this was symbolic. By continuing to wear them, Victoria lent legitimacy to a style that was rapidly becoming impractical for her subjects. Let's not forget that industry, too, was changing. The rise of department stores meant that consumers were no longer visiting cobblers to be measured for a single pair of shoes. Instead, people bought off the shelf. And it's difficult to mass-produce a perfectly fitting button boot. Laces offered adjustability. Buttons required precision. If a customer's ankle was slightly wider or narrower than expected, the fit failed and returns increased. There was also the issue of maintenance. Buttons popped off, button hooks bent, tiny loops frayed or shrank when wet. Cobbler shops offered repairs, but for the growing working class, why repair when you could replace? By the 1900s, advertisements for boots had shifted dramatically. Where once they boasted about the elegance of the button line or the quality of imported buttons, they now touted quick fastening systems, flexible soles, and comfort linings. Speed and comfort had overtaken elegance and ritual. Even the beloved button hook was slowly fading from daily life. Once found in every vanity drawer and dressing set, these tiny tools became relics. Children played with them. They were repurposed as letter openers. Some were melted down during wartime metal shortages. A few were kept as keepsakes, mementos of a more ceremonial age. And then, around the 1910s, it happened. The button boot began to vanish from everyday wardrobes. Not in a dramatic collapse, but in a quiet recession, replaced by laced boots, Oxford shoes, and eventually, the low-heeled leather pump. Yet something curious occurred in this period: nostalgia. As the world plunged into the mechanical modernity of the 20th century, some fashion circles began to look backward. Button boots, once abandoned as inconvenient, were revived in romanticized styles. Edwardian costumes, vintage photographs, and even stage productions of Victorian dramas featured the iconic footwear. But in real life, they were done. So what does the final death of the button boot tell us about the changing rhythms of daily life? Why did we trade beauty for speed? And what became of the cobblers and craftspeople who once shaped society from the ankle down? By the early 20th century, the button boot had lost its grip not only on the ankle, but on the collective imagination. The very object that once defined social decorum, class precision, and personal restraint had become a curious artifact of a slower, more constrained time. The years between 1910 and 1950 would not just change fashion, they would reorder the very way people thought about clothing. And the demise of the button boot serves as a subtle but telling indicator of the global transition towards speed, standardization, and self-sufficiency. War and the collapse of formal footwear. The First World War, 1914–1918, reshaped the material world. In wartime, every object was scrutinized for utility, and footwear was no exception. Soldiers needed boots that could endure mud, water, and long marches, quickly fastened, easily removed, and durable under pressure. Button boots had no place in the trenches. The war brought about the standard-issue military boot, laced leather, and built for endurance. These designs filtered back into civilian life after the war ended. Returning soldiers were not inclined to adopt fiddly-button shoes, nor were the millions of women who had stepped into new roles as factory workers, farmers, and clerks, while the men were at the front. Women, too, began to demand practical shoes. After years of struggling with restrictive clothing, many found they preferred the simplicity of walking boots and laced shoes. The button boot came to symbolize an outdated femininity, one rooted in dependence, vanity, and a slower domestic rhythm that no longer suited the world of post-war progress. This transformation was reflected in both advertising and manufacturing. By the early 1920s, shoe catalogs across Britain, Europe, and America had almost entirely phased out button boots. The few that remained were sold as heritage styles or for formal occasions. Some were even produced as theatrical costume pieces. And yet, the memory of the buttoned boot lingered. The button hook in the drawer. One of the most poignant remnants of this era was the humble button hook. These tools, once ornate, essential, and lovingly crafted, began to slip quietly into the backs of kitchen drawers and forgotten dressing tables. Some were repurposed as tools for threading elastic or lacing corsets. Others were passed down, their uses no longer known by younger generations. By the 1930s, children might ask, "What is this thing?" And their parents might answer, "It was for boots long ago." Collectors today will tell you that button hooks are among the most common antiques found in flea markets and estate sales, not because they were rare, but because they were once so ubiquitous. They were like safety pins or spare buttons, a part of the fabric of daily life, until suddenly they were. Fashion forgets. Between the 1920s and the 1950s, the pace of change in women's and men's fashion accelerated rapidly. Hemlines rose, silhouettes relaxed, and formality gave way to functionality. As cities grew larger and faster, the needs of modern people diverged even further from the sartorial rituals of their parents and grandparents. The new icons of fashion were no longer Victorian. They were jazz-age dancers, cinema stars, aviators, typists, and soldiers. In this world, the button boot appeared quaint, even comical. It was parodied in vintage postcards and silent films. In stage comedies, characters fumbled with their boots to great comedic effect. The act of buttoning became a symbol of indecision, delay, and impracticality. By the time World War II arrived in the 1940s, the button boot had become essentially extinct in day-to-day wear. Wartime austerity measures prioritized rationed materials. Footwear was regulated and repaired, not adorned. Factory-made, standardized shoes flooded the market. No one had time for buttons. And when the war ended, the world emerged with a different relationship to fashion. The new look of the late 1940s introduced fresh glamour, yes, but it was grounded in sleekness and simplicity. Pointed-toe pumps, ballet flats, and stacked-heel lace-ups became the new norm. The ankle, once tightly buttoned, was now free. Resurgence in memory and museum. Oddly enough, as soon as the button boot disappeared from life, it began to reappear in nostalgia. In the 1950s and 60s, costume dramas and historical pageants revived Victorian fashion. Museum exhibits and antique books began to chart the evolution of clothing with fresh curiosity. The button boot, in this context, was no longer impractical, it was romantic, a symbol of a bygone world. Vintage catalogs were reprinted. Shoemakers specializing in historic footwear began producing reproductions for theater, reenactment, and collectors. Today, high-end reproductions of button boots can be found online, often sold to vintage enthusiasts or historical costumers. But this revival is purely symbolic. We wear them not because we must, but because they remind us of a time when even the act of dressing demanded patience, tools, and someone else's hands. A final reflection. So what do we take from the rise and fall of the button boot? On one level, it's a tale of materials, mechanisms, and changing manufacturing practices. On another, it's a deeply human story, about time, class, and the values encoded into everyday rituals. The button boot was never just about footwear. It was about control of the body, of time, of social presentation. It required effort, coordination, and patience, and it quietly revealed who had help dressing and who did not, who could afford time and who had to rush, who remained still and who had to move. When we look back at these seemingly minor historical details, we are reminded of how thoroughly objects shape our lives, not with loud proclamations but through repetition, through tools like the button hook, the daily routine, and the curve of a stiff leather boot. Today, we slip on sneakers or zip up boots in seconds. We don't think of ankles as a moral battleground. We dress for speed and ease, not ceremony. But still, if you've ever struggled with a zipper that sticks, or a shoelace that refuses to stay tied, maybe you've felt a brief flicker of empathy for the Victorian woman, hunched over her boots, struggling with 16 tiny buttons and a hook no longer than her finger. History, after all, isn't just made by battles and declarations. Sometimes it's stitched into the seams, or fastened tightly around the ankle. Story 3. Whalebone Woes, Corsets, Trade, and the Hidden Cost of Fashion. If you were to examine the contents of a fashionable woman's wardrobe in the 18th century, you'd find few items more central and more quietly oppressive than the corset. Though we often imagine the corset as an item of high drama, lace-bound and gasp-inducing, it was, in truth, an everyday garment. It was as common in its time as the brassiere or shapewear is today. But behind its rows of eyelets and stiffened seams lies a story not of seduction or elegance, but of international trade, resource extraction, bodily discipline, and slow, quiet suffering. Let us begin at the beginning, not with fashion, but with whalebone. Whalebone, despite its name, is not bone at all. It is baleen, a fibrous keratin substance that grows in the mouths of certain whales, such as the bowhead or right whale. These long, comb-like plates allowed whales to filter feed in the oceans, but to European corset makers, they were something else entirely. Lightweight, flexible, and most importantly, able to hold a rigid shape without splintering. Beginning in the 17th century, as European whaling operations expanded into Arctic waters and the North Atlantic, baleen became a coveted commodity, not for sustenance, but for structure. Corset makers discovered that strips of baleen could be used to stiffen the bodices of dresses, creating the flat, upright torso that was considered ideal in early modern fashion. Over time, corsets evolved to include multiple channels, long, narrow fabric tubes into which these bones were inserted. The more baleen a corset contained, the more supportive and more expensive it became. By the 18th century, baleen was essential to the construction of nearly all structured garments worn by European women, and less famously, by men and children as well. But to truly understand the corset, we must think of it not as a standalone item, but as part of a broader system of shaping the body. In 1700s Britain and France, the ideal female figure was one of contrasts, a sharply narrowed waist between a broad, stiffened chest and wide, hooped skirts. This was not about revealing the body. In fact, it was about concealing it entirely within architectural forms, turning the wearer into a carefully composed silhouette. Corsets weren't worn simply to reduce waist size, as is often assumed. In many cases, they were used to lift the bust, flatten the stomach, and enforce upright posture. In young girls, they were thought to instill grace and prevent slouching. Some medical authorities even claimed they were necessary for spinal health, though others warned against their dangers. The average corset was laced at the back, with some styles including wooden busks, flat, removable slats inserted down the center front for added rigidity. These were sometimes elaborately carved or inscribed with romantic messages, gifted from lovers or husbands. But always, baleen remained the secret ingredient. And it was no secret how valuable it had become. By the mid-18th century, whaling had grown into a global industry, with British and American ships sailing far into Arctic and South Pacific waters in search of whales. These expeditions were dangerous, grueling, and often fatal. Whalemen faced freezing temperatures, crushing waves, and long months away from home, all to harvest oil, meat, and baleen. And while whale oil lit lamps and powered industry, baleen was bound for the parlors of Europe, where it would be sewn into corsets, hoops, and even parasols and fans. It was also used in less glamorous objects like carriage springs, fishing rods, and umbrella ribs. Few consumers gave much thought to where their corset bonning came from. They didn't see the whale flensed on the decks of a ship off Greenland, nor the sailors slipping and sliding across blood-slicked boards. They only saw the final product, The beautifully shaped bodice, the controlled posture, the fashion plates in the ladies' magazine illustrating the latest silhouettes from Paris or Vienna. Corsets were stitched by skilled hands, often women working in modest tailoring shops. Some corsetiers gained regional fame. In London and Edinburgh, shops specializing in stays and underpinnings became essential parts of the fashion economy. For many women, corset making was one of the few skilled trades available, and the demand never waned. Middle-class women might own a few well-fitted corsets, adjusted by hand over the years. Wealthy women ordered them bespoke, made to measure, and often adjusted for pregnancy, travel, or different social functions. Poorer women bought second-hand or hand-me-down stays, patching the fabric when it wore thin and reusing the baleen until it split or frayed. The corset was not just about fashion, it was a mechanism of discipline. It told the body where to go, how to stand, how to move, how to be still. Young girls were often put into stays by age 7 or 8, not to cinch their waists, but to train posture. Diaries from the time describe girls practicing their curtsies, balancing books on their heads, and standing still for long periods, skills that prepared them for a world in which elegance was a kind of stillness. The pressure wasn't only physical, there was social pressure too. To appear without proper stays was, in many circles, scandalous. Even the lower classes adopted simplified corsets without full baleen supports, but with enough structure to smooth the body beneath clothes. Advertisements from the 18th century sometimes offered stays in various styles: for maids, for matrons, and for mourning. The corset had become, quietly and thoroughly, a symbol of virtue. And yet, even as it reshaped women, it was reshaping the world. The global demand for baleen was altering ecosystems. Whale populations were in steep decline by the late 1700s. Bowhead and right whales, once abundant in northern waters, became harder to find. Whalers pushed further into new territories, sometimes traveling for years at sea to return with a full cargo of oil and baleen. All of this so that someone in Bath or Lyon could stand a little straighter, so that a girl in Dublin might impress her suitor, so that a woman in London could be told she was respectable. But as the 19th century loomed, change was on the horizon. New materials were being developed, fashion was beginning to shift, and voices quiet at first were questioning the wisdom of forcing the body into unnatural shapes. So what happened when fashion collided with science? When industrialization began to challenge whaling as a source of material wealth? And when the body, long disciplined, began to rebel? As the 19th century dawned, the corset remained firmly laced into European life, but the world around it was shifting rapidly, irreversibly. Factories began to hum, trains shrieked, steamships crossed oceans in weeks instead of months, and with every advance, society's grip on the body, once controlled by baleen and hand stitching, grew more mechanical. This was the age of industrial corsetry. Let us begin in Victorian England, where fashion, modesty, and social progress marched uneasily side by side. By 1830, corsets had evolved from stiff, flat-fronted stays to a more sculptural form that mimicked and molded the curves of the female torso. These newer designs emphasized the hourglass figure, fuller bust, narrower waist, rounded hips. This silhouette wasn't just idealized in fashion, it became the measure of femininity itself. The waist, once simply defined by a belt or sash, now became an object of obsession. Corsets were no longer only about posture or support. They became tools of transformation, and baleen, still the gold standard for corset bonning, was central to this evolution. At the height of the fashion, some corsets contained 30, 40, even 50 narrow strips of whale baleen, carefully sewn into channels that followed the lines of the torso. The more structured the corset, the more dramatic the effect. Some models even had steel busks at the front, a stiffened, central opening allowing wearers to fasten the corset themselves, rather than requiring full lacing from behind. But the stiffening elements, whether bone or steel, were not soft to the skin. Baleen was not always smooth. It could crack, splinter, or curve with use. Steel could rust, snap, or press against the ribs. To counter this, corsets were padded or lined, but still, injuries were not uncommon. Women developed bruised ribs, abrasions, or sore backs from long-term wear. And yet demand only increased. Part of this was due to mass production. The corset industry grew from small tailoring shops to full-scale factories. In England and America, companies like Warner Brothers Corset Company and Thompson's glove-fitting corsets employed hundreds of workers, mostly women, in noisy rooms filled with sewing machines and baleen-cutting tools. Working-class women now had access to ready-made corsets sold in department stores or by mail-order catalog. These weren't custom-fit, of course, but they were close enough. And they came in styles ranging from strong working corsets to delicate, lace-trimmed evening wear. Corsets were even marketed for children and infants, often under the guise of postural correction. The goal wasn't only appearance, it was control. The shaping of the body began in girlhood and continued, in some cases, until the grave. The medical community was divided. Some doctors, particularly in Britain and France, decried tight lacing as dangerous and debilitating. They cited crushed internal organs, shallow breathing, digestive problems, and spinal damage. Others defended corsetry as a health aid, arguing that it supported weak backs and promoted elegance. In truth, most women did not wear their corsets tightly enough to cause serious injury. The notorious 16-inch waist was rare, even in its time, but the pressure to appear cinched was intense. Portrait photography, for example, often featured women posed in their best corsets, laced tightly for the occasion. These images were circulated widely and became fashion references, even though the tight lacing was often temporary and uncomfortable. Meanwhile, the whaling industry strained to keep up with demand. By mid-century, whale populations were critically diminished. British and American whaling ships pushed further into the Pacific, and by the 1850s, whaling had reached as far as Japan and Antarctica. Entire communities from New Bedford, Massachusetts to Peterhead, Scotland depended on whale products for economic survival. But fewer whales meant higher prices, and higher prices meant innovation. Enter the era of corset substitutes. In the 1860s, experiments began with steel stays, thin, flexible strips of tempered metal that could be flattened and cut to shape. Though stiffer than baleen, they were cheap, durable, and easily mass-produced. Steel allowed corsets to be constructed quickly and in more dramatic shapes. Later, manufacturers also introduced featherbone, a patented material made from turkey quills. It was marketed as a humane and vegetarian alternative to baleen, though it was not particularly soft or flexible. Despite these changes, whalebone remained the luxury standard. Wealthy women, or those attending society balls and formal events, continued to favor corsets with real baleen. It shaped the body with a subtle, yielding firmness that other materials couldn't replicate. Advertisements proudly listed real whalebone as a mark of quality well into the 1880s. But the winds of change were stirring. Some women, particularly in reformist circles, began to question the necessity of corsets entirely. The Rational Dress Society, formed in London in 1881, campaigned against tight lacing and promoted looser, more health-conscious clothing. In America, advocates like Amelia Bloomer and Elizabeth Cady Stanton criticized corsets as tools of oppression, symbols of women's subservience to beauty standards and male expectations. Still, the corset remained popular. Even as medical corsets emerged for weak backs and nervous conditions, the average woman continued to wear them not for health but for fashion. It was what was done, and undoing that expectation was not something that could be laced or unlaced overnight. At its peak, the corset was not just clothing, it was infrastructure, a hidden support system for the entire structure of Victorian life. But by the 1890s, a new silhouette was emerging, one that would quietly unravel centuries of structure, bone by bone. So what led to the final decline of the corset? How did new fabrics, changing morals, and the shock of modern war finally reshape the female form? And what legacy did Boleyn leave behind, long after the whales were gone? By the final decade of the 19th century, the corset, once an unquestioned pillar of fashion and social propriety, stood at a quiet crossroads. For over 300 years, it had been the framework upon which femininity was built, pressing, lifting, supporting, and confining. And yet, in the span of just a few decades, the corset would be challenged, altered, abandoned, and eventually tucked away into drawers of history along with the whales that made its structure possible. The 1890s began with yet another shift in silhouette. Women's fashion, which had oscillated between rigid and flowing, now embraced the so-called S-curve corset. This design forced the hips backward and the chest forward, creating a swan-like posture that was considered both elegant and somehow natural. The health corset, as it was often marketed, claimed to allow freer breathing and better spinal alignment. But despite its more comfortable claims, it was still a corset. Steel or baleen stays remained, lacing persisted, and expectations endured. Yet even as the fashion world clung to structured forms, the world was changing too quickly for the corset to keep up. The first break in the bonding, World War I, 1914–1918. When war broke out in 1914, entire industries were repurposed for the war effort. Steel was needed for weapons and machinery. Baleen, already scarce from overhunting, became increasingly difficult to source. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. They drove ambulances, ran factories, sorted mail, and staffed offices. They no longer had time or patience for elaborate understructures that restricted movement and breathing. Corsets, once essential, were now impractical. In the United States, the War Industries Board estimated that eliminating corsets from production during the war saved over 28,000 tons of metal, enough to build 2 full battleships. This wasn't merely symbolic. It marked a break in routine, a recalibration of what was normal to wear. For the first time in centuries, women got dressed without bonning, laces, or hidden compression, and many, though not all, chose not to go back. The brassiere takes the stage. In 1914, the same year war began, an American socialite named Mary Phelps Jacob patented a new kind of undergarment, the brassiere. Hers was made of 2 silk handkerchiefs and pink ribbon, light, flexible, and entirely free of bonning. Though bras didn't become widespread until the 1920s, their invention marked a cultural shift. By separating the chest from the waist and removing the need for full torso support, they freed women's movement and dress alike. The 1920s embraced the flapper silhouette, straight, narrow, and almost boyish. Fashion no longer emphasized the hourglass figure. The waist was de-emphasized. Dresses hung loose. Women cut their hair, and corsets were, if not forgotten, at least abandoned by many. Manufacturers tried to adjust. They created lighter corsets, girdles, and foundation garments. Some were little more than elastic waistbands. Others retained vestiges of earlier corsetry, but the cultural tide had turned. By the 1930s, corsets were still sold but increasingly marketed as medical or support devices rather than fashion essentials. They were for older women, for back pain, or for posture correction. The language of elegance was replaced with the language of functionality. Even the terminology changed. Stays became support. Lacing became elastic panels. The ornate was replaced by the efficient. The whales disappear. Meanwhile, the material at the heart of corset history, baleen, was disappearing. By the 1920s, most corsets were made with spiral steel bonding, celluloid, or feather bone. Whaling, once a global engine of wealth and industry, had collapsed. The bowhead and right whales, hunted to near extinction, were no longer viable commercial resources. And with the rise of petrochemical plastics in the mid-20th century, even the idea of organic structure faded. The corset, it seemed, had outlived not only its fashion relevance but its ecological foundation as well. Corsets in memory and revival. Yet corsets did not disappear entirely. As with many once mandatory garments, they were resurrected in fantasy. In the 1950s, with the rise of Christian Dior's new look, fashion briefly returned to cinched waists and structured silhouettes. But these forms were created more through design and fabric manipulation than internal corsetry. The corset was no longer required. It was imitated rather than worn. In later decades, corsets became the stuff of theater, subculture, and nostalgia. In punk and goth fashion, they were symbols of rebellion. In historical films, they were costumes. In some bridal wear and haute couture, they returned not as daily garments but as special occasion curiosities. And yet, there was something undeniably haunting about their return. Behind the lacing and busks lay the memory of a world where bodies, mostly women's bodies, were shaped by external forces, cultural, material, and social. The corset story is not simply one of fashion. It is a tale of trade routes, industrialization, ecological collapse, medical debate, and shifting values. It teaches us that something as intimate as underwear can reveal the workings of an entire world. The corset is gone now from daily life at least, but in its place we have shapewear, compression garments, padded bras, and performance leggings. The pressure to shape, smooth, and control the body hasn't vanished. It has only changed its uniform. And perhaps that's the final irony. In seeking freedom from whalebone, have we simply exchanged one kind of structure for another, less visible perhaps, but just as persistent? Story 4. The Great Pocket Scandal. Why women's clothes didn't have pockets. Today, a pocket is easy to take for granted. You might reach into yours to find a phone, a coin, a tissue, maybe a note or two. But for centuries, particularly for women, a pocket was more than a convenience. It was a symbol of freedom, autonomy, and sometimes subversion. And its disappearance from women's fashion tells a story not just of fabric and design, but of power. Let's begin, curiously, before pockets even existed. In early modern Europe, roughly, the 1600s, clothing did not include sewn-in pockets of any kind. Men and women alike carried small bags or pouches, tied around the waist or worn beneath garments. These early pouches were the ancestors of both the pocket and the handbag. They held coins, keys, thimbles, smelling salts, snuff, needles, tiny artifacts of everyday life. For women particularly, these pouches were both private and practical. Hidden beneath voluminous skirts, women wore tie-on pockets, separate cloth compartments attached to a ribbon or string and fastened around the waist. Slits were left in the side seams of petticoats, allowing access to the pockets beneath. If you peeked into one, you might find a mix of ordinary and personal. A small prayer book, sewing kit, fruit, notes from children, or in some cases, contraband letters, herbs, or coins not meant for others to see. In an age when women's lives were largely domestic, and when property laws excluded them from ownership in many cases, the tie-on pocket became something quietly radical, a space of their own. But this began to change with fashion. By the late 1700s, the silhouette of women's clothing began to narrow. The wide, layered skirts of the earlier 18th century were replaced by the empire waistline inspired by neoclassical aesthetics. This style featured high waists, flowing muslin fabrics, and slim, draped skirts. There was no room, quite literally, for bulky tie-on pockets beneath these garments. And so they disappeared. Instead, women were encouraged to carry reticules, small drawstring purses, often elaborately embroidered or beaded, just large enough to hold a handkerchief and a few coins. These were the early ancestors of modern handbags. But unlike their hidden predecessors, they were visible, delicate, and often more decorative than practical. This shift wasn't just sartorial, it was symbolic. As the physical space that women could carry on their bodies shrank, so too did their privacy, mobility, and independence. The reticule had to be carried in the hand, limiting movement. It announced its presence, and it couldn't be trusted to keep anything secure. Meanwhile, men's fashion was moving in the opposite direction. Trousers became standard male attire by the early 1800s, replacing breeches. And with trousers came sewn-in pockets, side pockets, back pockets, watch pockets, even coat and vest pockets. A man could carry keys, a wallet, a notebook, and never once expose or announce his belongings. The result was a quiet bifurcation. Men's clothing became practical. Women's clothing became performative. The pocket simple, unseen was the dividing line. Throughout the 19th century, women's garments remained mostly pocketless. Some exceptions existed, especially among working-class women, who still tied pockets beneath aprons or wore sturdy, utilitarian dresses with hidden compartments. But middle and upper-class fashion prioritized slimness, decoration, and passivity. Even when the crinoline came into style in the 1850s, a cage-like structure that dramatically widened skirts, the pocket did not return. Why? In part because women's garments were increasingly made by dressmakers, not at home. Custom construction made alterations difficult, and the idea of including a space for hidden belongings was simply not a priority in a world where women were expected to be accompanied, attended to, or stationary. Magazines of the day offered elaborate patterns for handbags and reticules, but rarely addressed pockets. In literature, when a woman reached for a letter or a key, she found it in her sewing basket, her drawer, or more often, asked a servant or male relative to retrieve it. The pocket, in other words, became a male space. And for women, its absence was increasingly normalized. But not everyone accepted this quietly. Some women adapted. Hidden compartments were sewn into petticoats. Aprons were made with secret slits. In rare cases, women demanded that dressmakers include a pocket, but it was the exception, not the rule. The lack of pockets became, slowly, a sign of virtue. A woman with nothing on her person had nothing to hide. She relied on others, her husband, her father, her maid. She did not wander. She did not need to carry things. Her role was to be present, not prepared. And yet some women were prepared. There are stories, quiet, often undocumented, of women hiding letters to lovers in the seams of gowns or smuggling pamphlets beneath their skirts. Tie-on pockets never disappeared entirely. They simply went underground, much like the resistance they often supported. By the late 1800s, the absence of the pocket had become so routine that it was no longer questioned. Or was it? In the coming decades, as women began to move through public space in new ways, working, organizing, walking, demand for practicality grew. So when did the conversation about women's pockets finally reemerge? Who led the call for clothing that functioned? And what exactly was at stake in the return of a space so small, so ordinary, and yet so powerful? By the final decades of the 19th century, women were beginning to move not just through physical space, but through society itself. They were organizing, agitating, teaching, and marching. They were riding bicycles, publishing essays, entering offices. They were, in short, doing things that required them to carry things. And yet, the pocket remained conspicuously absent from their clothing. In its place, the handbag, the muff, the reticule, decorative, often impractical accessories that were more burden than solution. As the modern woman emerged, so too did the quiet frustration over the persistent lack of pockets. But for many, this frustration was more than sartorial. It was ideological. The rational dress movement and the question of function. In 1881, a group of reformers in London founded the Rational Dress Society. Their goal was clear: to fight for women's clothing that was healthy, comfortable, and practical. That meant rejecting tight corsets, heavy skirts, and shoes that deformed the foot, but it also meant reintroducing pockets. Leaflets and essays from the society noted the absurdity of women's clothing lacking any storage while men enjoyed multiple, hidden and functional compartments. One satirical cartoon published in a British newspaper in the 1890s showed a woman balancing half a dozen bags, purses, and parcels, each labeled, "What I must carry because my dress has no pockets." In contrast, the man beside her, hands free, walked easily down the street. The message was simple: lack of pockets equals dependence. A woman without pockets was a woman who needed assistance. She couldn't carry her own money, her own tools, or even her own house key without exposing the fact that she was carrying it. She had to hold everything, or tuck it awkwardly, or worse, rely on someone else. Clothing reformers recognized that this wasn't just a matter of comfort. It was a reflection of social control. If you limit what a woman can carry, you limit where she can go, how long she can be gone, and what she can do when she gets there. The bicycle and the pocket. In the 1890s, the bicycle craze offered a surprising boost to pocket advocacy. Bicycling was a profoundly liberating activity for women, and cycling attire reflected that. Bloomers, rational skirts, and jackets all allowed for greater movement, and for the first time in decades, included functional pockets. Cycling suits, often sold by specialty outfitters, featured multiple sewn-in compartments. These weren't just for style, they were for necessity. A cyclist might need to carry a coin purse, a repair tool, a map, or a handkerchief. Male cyclists had always done this. Now women demanded the same. This wasn't universally accepted. Conservative commentators criticized the practicality of cycling clothes as mannish, ugly, or unfeminine. But for women who were moving fast on wheels, and through society, fashion had to adapt to the pace of change. And so did the pocket. The suffragette pocket. During the height of the women's suffrage movement in the early 20th century, pockets took on an even more political role. Many suffragettes wore simple, functional clothing for marches and organizing. They needed garments that could hold pamphlets, protest pins, letters, food, and bail money. The typical handbag was inadequate, so activists revived the internal pocket, either sewn into the lining of jackets or hidden in skirts and shirtwaists. A suffragette's pocket was not just practical, it was symbolic. It held the tools of resistance. Newspapers at the time, particularly those opposed to the movement, sometimes described women's pockets with suspicion. One 1911 editorial referred to the dangerous new habit of female concealment, a pointed remark not about crime, but about control. For centuries, women's pockets had been largely invisible, hidden under layers of cloth. Now they were back and openly associated with agency, independence, and the ability to act alone. World War I and the rise of practical dress. When war broke out in 1914, everything changed. As millions of men were sent to the front, women stepped into jobs that had previously been off-limits. They became factory workers, transport operators, messengers, and more. And to do those jobs, they were issued uniforms, trousers, jackets, overalls. And every one of those uniforms had pockets. At first, many women found it startling to wear such garments, but quickly they appreciated the convenience. With pockets, they could move freely, carry tools or supplies, and work without restriction. After the war, many women were reluctant to return to pocketless fashion. And yet, fashion did return. When the 1920s arrived, the post-war silhouette was sleek and androgynous. Dresses hung straight, waists dropped. Some garments had shallow hip pockets, often decorative, sometimes functional, but handbags remained dominant. Coco Chanel's designs in the 1920s and 30s included some real pockets in jackets and coats, but they were still relatively rare in everyday dresses. And in many cases, when pockets did appear, they were token gestures, too shallow for use, sewn shut, or decorative flaps only. Magazines praised the clean line of pocketless garments. Retailers marketed handbags as indispensable companions. And even women's trousers, when they began to appear more widely, were often designed with fewer and smaller pockets than men's. The war had opened the door, but fashion, in its cyclical nature, was pushing it closed again. Still, the conversation about pockets had begun, and it would not be forgotten. So why, even into the 20th century, did women's clothes continue to lack functional pockets? How did marketing, commerce, and lingering gender norms shape what women were allowed to wear and carry? And would pockets ever truly return, not as novelty but as standard? As the 20th century progressed, fashion continued to dance around the question of pockets in women's clothing, offering glimpses of functionality, only to retreat again into performance. The issue had moved far beyond fabric and stitching. Pockets had become a cultural battleground, quietly contested through design choices, marketing strategies, and assumptions about what women's bodies and lives were meant to contain. By the 1930s and 40s, the fashion pendulum was swinging yet again. War was once again reshaping the world, and with it, what women wore. World War II, practicality returns. During World War II, utility trumped aesthetics once more. In Britain, the government's utility clothing scheme introduced standardized garments made with limited materials, designed for durability and function. Women's trousers, coats, and skirt suits during this time often included real, functional pockets. Women in the war effort serving as mechanics, codebreakers, nurses, and factory workers required clothing that allowed them to move and carry tools. Just as in World War I, pockets were not optional, they were essential. And for a brief moment, women's clothing reflected this reality. Photographs from the 1940s show women confidently striding in belted coats with deep pockets, overalls with chest pockets, trousers with side slits, garments designed to serve, not just to show. But the moment did not last. The post-war retreat. When peace returned in 1945, so too did a retreat from practicality and fashion. Designers like Christian Dior, with his 1947 new look, led the charge. Dior's designs emphasized nipped waists, full skirts, and soft, flowing lines. The silhouette was romantic, indulgent, and deeply nostalgic for pre-war femininity. Pockets, if present at all, they were decorative, small, or sewn shut. Fashion editors praised the return of elegance, but others, particularly working women and mothers, felt an unmistakable loss. Once again, the handbag became a necessary extension of a woman's body. Everything she might carry had to be externalized, exposed, and separated from the garments she wore. As consumerism expanded in the 1950s and 60s, women were increasingly targeted by marketing that linked appearance with self-worth. Clothing was to be flattering, slimming, and cleanly cut. Bulges were to be hidden, lines smoothed. And so, pockets were trimmed away, deemed unflattering or too masculine. Even women's jeans, which rose to prominence in the 1960s and 70s, were often made with shallower pockets than their male counterparts. This was not accidental, it was intentional design. The purse as prison. By the 1980s, handbags had become big business. Fashion houses began designing high-end purses and accessories specifically targeted at women. Entire advertising campaigns revolved around the perfect bag, not just for style but for necessity. If women's garments had no pockets, then the handbag became essential. And if it was essential, then it could be sold, branded, and replaced again and again. A woman's dependence on the handbag was quietly baked into her relationship with fashion. The pocketless dress became standard. Slim trousers came with sewn-shut slits. Business suits often included decorative flaps but no compartments. Even maternity clothes designed for women growing life lacked the capacity to hold keys or a phone. By contrast, men's clothing not only retained functional pockets, it expanded them. Cargo pants, blazers, overcoats, and jeans all boasted multiple compartments. A man could leave the house with nothing but the clothes he wore and have everything he needed. A woman, no matter how practical, was expected to carry her life externally. This subtle difference translated into hours of inconvenience, physical burden, and often overlooked economic inequality. Women's purses are routinely stolen. They're expensive to replace. They limit movement, require one hand, and restrict spontaneous activity. The pocket is freedom, the lack of it, a lifelong inconvenience. Modern resistance and the return of the pocket. In the 2010s, a new wave of activism began to draw attention to the absurd disparity in pocket design. Social media campaigns like "We Want Pockets" gained traction. Articles were published comparing the depths of men's and women's jeans. In one viral example, a woman's front jeans pocket was only 48% as deep as a man, in the same brand and size. Designers began to take notice. Some labels, especially those focused on gender-neutral or functional fashion, started to include real, deep pockets in women's garments. Outdoor brands, utilitarian fashion lines, and workwear companies began offering clothing that considered women's actual lives, not just their appearance. There was and still is resistance. Fashion houses, particularly in the luxury space, continue to favor clean lines, tight silhouettes, and the need for a matching handbag. Retailers argue that women don't want bulk, prefer accessories, or won't pay for utilitarian design. But the pushback is growing. A pocket full of meaning. Ultimately, the pocket is not just a piece of cloth. It is a metaphor. A pocket is freedom of movement. It is autonomy. It is security, privacy, preparedness. It is the ability to go out into the world and carry something with you: money, tools, keys, knowledge, without asking for help. The fact that this simple, almost invisible feature has been systematically withheld from half the population for centuries is not just a design oversight. It is a design of the world itself. And even now, despite modern technology, women are still more likely to carry a bag than to reach into their own clothes for what they need. So the next time you slip your hand into your pocket without thinking, consider what it means to have that space, and what it means still when others don't. Story 5. Crinolines and Catastrophes. When Dresses Caught Fire. You're standing near a fireplace. The room is crowded. A gentle rustling of silk and taffeta follows you as you walk, the fabric swaying around your ankles like a floating curtain. You move to warm your hands, but before you realize, your dress has brushed too close to the flame, and in a flash, you are on fire. This was not a rare occurrence. In the mid-19th century, women's fashion, particularly the crinoline, combined aesthetic grandeur with a terrifying vulnerability. The crinoline was, quite literally, a fashion hazard. Beneath its graceful volume lay sharp wire, highly flammable fabrics, and no easy escape. Let us begin with the basics. What exactly was a crinoline? The word crinoline originally referred to a stiff fabric made from a blend of horsehair, crin, and lin, used to support petticoats. But by the 1850s, it had evolved into a structural undergarment, an elaborate bell-shaped cage made of steel hoops sewn into cotton tape. The invention of the steel cage crinoline in the late 1840s and early 1850s revolutionized women's fashion. For the first time, women could achieve the enormous skirt silhouettes that had been popular in aristocratic courts without layering dozens of heavy, heat-trapping petticoats. Steel crinolines were light, relatively inexpensive, and widely available. Manufacturers like Thompson's skirt supporters in England and American companies in New York began producing them by the tens of thousands. They could be folded, expanded, and worn by women across the social spectrum from duchesses to domestic servants. The result was visual drama. Skirts reached widths of 4, 5, even 6 feet across. Fashion plates from the era show women gliding like domed ships across ballroom floors. Paintings depict elegant silhouettes hovering over patterned carpets, framed by high ceilings and candlelight. But while the crinoline lifted fashion to new heights, it brought with it a set of very real and very deadly dangers. Fire, the invisible threat. Victorian homes were filled with open flames from fireplaces to oil lamps to candles. Gas lighting was becoming common, but most domestic spaces still relied on flickering, exposed firelight. Combine that with a crinoline made of lightweight cotton, muslin, or silk, all extremely flammable, and you have a disaster waiting to happen. The steel cage of the crinoline kept the fabric far from the body, allowing flames to rise rapidly before the wearer could even feel heat. Once ignited, the structure acted like a chimney, drawing flames upward with astonishing speed. Many women who caught fire died not from burns alone, but from shock and inhalation of smoke and scorched fabric fumes. The very structure meant to free them from heavy petticoats often trapped them in burning cages. In some cases, the corsets and crinolines even caused mechanical injuries as the wearer tried to escape a snagged hoop, a twisted ankle, a stumble in panic. One of the most chilling accounts comes from 1861, when Emily and Sarah Fuller, daughters of a clergyman in England, both died within minutes of each other after their dresses caught fire while standing near a hearth. Their mother was also badly burned trying to save them. The event made national headlines and was followed by dozens of similar reports. In 1863, Oscar Wilde's half-sisters, Mary and Emily Wilde, perished in a similar tragedy during a ball in County Monaghan, Ireland. Their skirts brushed a fireplace, and both girls were engulfed in flames before help could arrive. The incident devastated the Wilde family and added to growing public awareness of the fashion's hidden dangers. Newspapers began publishing weekly stories of death by crinoline fire. The London Times estimated in 1864 that at least 3,000 women in Britain had died in the past decade due to skirt fires, an astonishing figure that barely captured the scope of the threat. A design flaw or a social pressure. The crinoline was not an accident of design, it was an intentional silhouette, heavily promoted by fashion journals, dressmakers, and popular imagery. But the tragedy of its flammability was not widely addressed in design circles until the death toll became impossible to ignore. And even then, criticism often centered not on the design itself, but on the women wearing them. Writers accused women of vanity, carelessness, or extravagance. A common refrain was that no modest woman would require such excessive volume in her dress. This criticism, of course, ignored the social pressures and fashion norms that demanded such shapes in the first place. Women were expected to look fashionable, graceful, and proper. Deviating from the norm could mean ridicule, exclusion, or accusations of sloppiness. To wear a slimmer silhouette was to risk being seen as old-fashioned or even poor. Therein lay the central tension. The very structure meant to signal femininity, propriety, and beauty also endangered the wearer, and society both demanded its use and blamed women for its consequences. Everyday dangers. While fires were the most dramatic danger, they were not the only one. Women wearing large crinolines frequently knocked over furniture, became stuck in doorways, or were blown about by wind. Carriages posed particular risk. Skirts could snag as a woman stepped in or out, leading to falls, twisted ankles, or even run-over skirts dragging women under wheels. In factories, the risks were greater still. Women working in industrial settings were forbidden from wearing crinolines due to the risk of getting caught in machinery. In one recorded case, a young worker's crinoline caught on a rotating shaft, pulling her into the engine and killing her instantly. Yet in homes, streets, and ballrooms, the crinoline remained. Women adjusted. They learned to hold their skirts just so when passing a lamp. They stepped cautiously near fireplaces. They turned sideways in tight spaces. They adapted to the restrictions because fashion demanded it. But how did society finally begin to move away from this dangerous trend? What changes in materials, design, and sensibilities brought about the fall of the crinoline? And did the dangers of women's fashion truly disappear or merely evolve? By the late 1860s, the reign of the crinoline ballooning and blazing its way through the Victorian imagination was beginning to falter. Slowly, awkwardly, and often without acknowledgement of the danger it posed, fashion began to turn its voluminous gaze in a new direction. But make no mistake, it wasn't fire that finally extinguished the crinoline. It was silhouette, the changing shape of fashion. Beginning around 1865, women's fashion began to pivot literally. The volume of the skirt, rather than billowing equally in all directions, began to shift toward the back. Designers introduced the crinolette, a narrower version of the steel hoop skirt, with fewer and smaller hoops toward the front and sides, concentrating the shape into a more streamlined train at the rear. The era of the bustle had begun. This change was influenced by shifting tastes, but also by practicality. The dangers of wide skirts, fire, collisions, mobility restrictions had become too obvious to ignore. While few publications outright declared crinolines dangerous, fashion commentators began praising the bustle as more manageable, modern, and suitable to the active woman. Of course, the bustle came with its own discomforts: back-heavy weight, complex draping, and the ever-present fear of sitting down too quickly, but it did reduce one very specific threat: catching fire from every angle. The shift wasn't immediate. In rural areas and among older generations, crinolines lingered. But in fashion centers like Paris and London, the hoop skirt quickly fell out of favor. By the early 1870s, the full dome shape had deflated into a slim front and sides with an exaggerated rear, sometimes supported with wire frames, horsehair pads, or folding bustles. Material matters, the quest for safety. Even as silhouettes changed, the materials used in dresses remained alarmingly flammable. Silks and muslins, light, beautiful, and prone to explosive burning, continued to dominate women's wardrobes. These fabrics were often untreated, meaning a small spark could ignite an entire gown in seconds. There were attempts at safety. Some chemists experimented with flame-retardant treatments using salts or borax, but these methods were expensive, altered the color and texture of fabric, and were never widely adopted. A few dressmakers began lining garments with wool or heavier cotton, slightly more flame-resistant, but this, too, was the exception. More often than not, the responsibility for safety fell not to the designers or manufacturers, but to the women themselves. Etiquette manuals offered tips. Don't stand too close to the fire. Always use a fire guard in the hearth. Keep a woolen rug nearby in case of emergencies. Have a servant present when dressing. These instructions quietly assumed that women would remain vulnerable, that fashion could not or would not adapt to protect them. Instead, they were taught to be cautious, still, and aware. Class, fire, and responsibility. Importantly, the dangers of crinolines and flammable fashion were not equally distributed. Upper-class women often had larger homes, better lighting, and servants nearby who could assist in an emergency. They also had access to safer environments: ballrooms, salons, country estates where the risk of open flames was lower. Working-class women, domestic servants, and girls in factories or small tenements faced far greater danger. They often wore cheaper fabrics, which burned more quickly, worked near open flames, and lived in tight spaces filled with crowded furniture, stoves, or candles. One tragic example comes from an 1870 report about a maid who leaned over to stir a pot and caught her dress on the stove. Her employer reportedly blamed the girl's clumsiness and deducted the cost of the ruined carpet from her wages. The lack of accountability from the fashion industry or employers was, in many such cases, chilling. Fire also became a literary motif in this era, used to symbolize passion, punishment, or even moral failure. In Jane Eyre, 1847, Charlotte Brontë famously uses fire both literally and metaphorically. The madwoman in the attic burns down the house. Later, Jane returns to find the man she loved, blinded by the flames. Fire became, in some cases, a narrative judgment, a fatal consequence for women who strayed too near danger. But in real life, these were not stories. They were preventable deaths suffered quietly, often alone. A quiet reckoning. By the 1880s, as fashion moved toward slimmer silhouettes, crinolines became obsolete not through outright rejection, but by slow abandonment. The tragic deaths associated with hoop skirts were largely forgotten, replaced with new concerns. The bustle's awkward profile, the weight of layered skirts, the challenge of new corset shapes. But a few publications remembered. In 1888, the Ladies' World published a reflective essay titled Fashions That Killed, which cataloged the most dangerous trends of the previous decades. Crinolines topped the list. The piece described the silent terror of standing near fire and the absurd expectation that women should dress dangerously for the sake of appearance. Still, there was no formal reckoning, no legislation, no design codes, no industry-wide response. The fashion world simply moved on, and the deaths by then, numbering in the thousands, became footnotes in a much larger narrative of progress. But this invites a broader question. How do we remember the quiet costs of beauty? What is lost when fashion prioritizes spectacle over safety? And do we still today accept unnecessary risks in the name of appearance? As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the age of the crinoline faded into fashion history, its dome-like silhouette remembered mostly in paintings, photographs, and museum displays. But its dangers, once so real and so tragically common, slowly slipped from public memory. The Victorian woman who caught fire from a brush with the hearth became a cautionary tale, then a curiosity, then, eventually, something close to a myth. But the lessons buried within those hoop skirts never truly disappeared. They remained silent, uncomfortable in the seam between what we wear and what it costs us. From crinoline to corset to consumer safety. By the 1890s, the bustle had taken its final bow, and fashion moved toward straighter, narrower lines. Gowns followed the body more closely. Fabrics remained elegant silk, satin, muslin, but the most dangerous, billowing shapes were gone. Yet, even without the crinoline, flammable clothing remained a hazard. In 1908, Princess Alice, Countess of Athlone, was badly burned when her tea gown caught fire from a gas stove. Several society women in the early 20th century suffered similar fates, and in working-class homes, open flames still posed threats to children and women in long, loose-fitting clothing. It wasn't until the mid-20th century, well into the era of synthetic fabrics, that flammability standards for clothing began to appear. In the United States, the turning point came in 1953 with the Flammable Fabrics Act, passed after a number of high-profile child burn incidents involving rayon and acetate fabrics. The law was amended and strengthened in 1967 to address the growing use of man-made materials in everyday garments. Britain followed with its own safety regulations, and by the 1970s, labeling requirements and flammability tests became standard practice for children's nightwear and other high-risk clothing categories. But this focus on safety was largely technical, not historical. The tragedies of the crinoline era were rarely cited. They were, by then, buried beneath a century of new headlines, new silhouettes, new concerns. Still, the issue remained. What happens when fashion ignores function? The modern echoes of a forgotten danger. Even in today's world surrounded by fire codes, synthetic blends, and fast fashion, the tension between aesthetic and safety has not entirely disappeared. Consider high heels, which routinely cause sprains, fractures, and long-term joint damage, continue to dominate formal wear. Tightly fitted shapewear restricts breathing and digestion. Certain festival fashion, made from inexpensive and highly flammable materials, poses real risks when worn near fire pits or fireworks. The fashion industry is quicker now to respond to hazards, but not necessarily to prevent them. There remains a cultural undertone that beauty, elegance, or even basic style requires a degree of risk or discomfort, a holdover from centuries of dressing for image over ease. The idea that to look proper is to endure something. And in this space, the ghost of the crinoline still lingers. The cultural memory of fire and fabric. While few today remember the daily dangers of 1850s dress, the image of the burning woman in skirts still haunts literature and film. In plays, novels, and costume dramas, the death by crinoline has become a symbol of excess, of vanity, of repression. Rarely is it told as a story of neglect, industry failure, or design oversight, yet that is precisely what it was. These were not freak accidents. They were predictable, preventable, and common. But the fashion of the time demanded the risk, and society refused to question it. There is something haunting about how quietly those deaths were accepted. No industry apology. No widespread movement. No shift in regulation, until long after the crinoline had gone out of style. Instead, the danger was absorbed into memory as an unfortunate footnote, as if the real tragedy was not the fire itself, but the fact that it burned through the carefully constructed image of womanhood the crinoline was meant to uphold. What we carry forward. Today, crinolines survive mostly in weddings, costume dramas, and historical reenactments. They're lighter, safer, and no longer worn daily. But they carry within them a certain lesson, a gentle warning, hidden in their elegant geometry. That warning isn't just about fire. It's about design without accountability, about expectations placed on women's bodies, and how those expectations can become cages, wire-framed or otherwise. And perhaps, most enduringly, it's about how easily society forgets the quiet cost of elegance when it's women who pay the price. Story 6. From Parasols to Protest. The umbrella as a symbol of class and control. In the quiet, sunlit gardens of 18th century Europe, a woman lifts a delicate parasol, lace-edged, ivory-handled, perhaps embroidered with soft floral motifs. It casts a modest shadow across her face, a silhouette of refinement and leisure. But this parasol is more than an accessory. It is a boundary, a symbol, a silent signal of class, control, and curiously immobility. To understand how the umbrella, and its fair-weather cousin the parasol, evolved into a tool of protest and power, we must first explore how it began as an object of exclusion. The birth of the parasol as class marker. Though umbrellas and parasols date back to ancient civilizations used in China, Egypt, India, and Greece, it was not until the 17th and 18th centuries that they became widespread symbols of Western upper-class fashion. In Europe, parasols were not designed to shield rain, but to guard the skin from sunlight. Pale skin, at the time, was a visual shorthand for social status. It implied that a woman did not work outdoors, that she was kept delicate and removed from the manual labor of the lower classes. Sun-darkened skin, by contrast, marked one as rural, servant class, or foreign. Thus, the parasol became both a shade and a shield, not from the elements, but from association with labor. To carry, a parasol was to visibly perform leisure. In Britain, France, and Italy, parasols evolved into ornate fashion statements. They were made of silk, lined with lace, framed with whalebone or ivory, and often matched with gloves, fans, and hat trimmings. Some were imported, others locally crafted, but all were symbols of elegant uselessness. They were not meant for utility, but for effect. Much like the corset or crinoline, the parasol was designed to restrict. One arm was occupied holding it aloft. Movement was slowed. The body was rendered more ornamental than functional. Women were instructed on how to hold the parasol. Etiquette guides advised precise angles for standing or sitting, how to close it gracefully, and how not to swing it lest one seem unruly. A parasol might be lightly tilted to offer conversation partners some shade, but only just. It was personal space made portable, but not quite shareable. The gender divide and shade. Men during this same period generally did not use parasols. Though early umbrellas adapted for rain had male adopters like Jonas Hanway in 18th century London, the sunshade remained resolutely feminine. A man concerned about sun exposure was seen as vain, foreign, or effeminate. Instead, men wore wide-brimmed hats or cloaks, or simply endured. This gender divide reinforced the parasol's role as a marker of feminine decorum, and also, paradoxically, of feminine confinement. A woman with a parasol was not meant to walk quickly. She was not meant to work, to sweat, or to act without supervision. She was to stroll, to pause, to rest in the shade of her own delicacy. The object thus reinforced a larger system of expectations. Be presentable but not assertive. Be visible but not exposed. Be ornamented but not burdened. Colonial echoes and global imagery. The parasol's status was not limited to Europe. In colonial settings, parasols were often used by European women to maintain their fashionable appearance in unfamiliar climates. Photographs from British India, French Indochina, and Dutch colonies frequently show women standing beneath parasols held by servants, local men, or children whose darkened skin was itself a reminder of the social hierarchy. The parasol thus carried not only class and gender symbolism, but also racial and imperial overtones. It was, quite literally, a portable assertion of superiority, one that blocked the sun, while revealing a world organized by who was expected to serve and who was expected to stroll. Even in Japan and China, where umbrellas and parasols had long existed independently, Western colonizers and missionaries interpreted their use through this same lens, often misunderstanding their purpose and symbolism, projecting their own class assumptions onto local customs. The shift to utility. As the 19th century progressed, particularly in the urban centers of Britain and America, umbrellas began to supplant parasols in daily life. Rain umbrellas, once ridiculed, had become normalized among both men and women by the mid-1800s. But parasols remained distinctly decorative and thus increasingly old-fashioned. The Industrial Revolution brought with it soot, smoke, and unpredictable weather. Parasols offered little protection against the gritty air of London or the muddy streets of Manchester. Women began to favor darker umbrellas that could withstand drizzle and coal dust. And yet, even as their practical value declined, parasols lingered in the world of ritual and fashion. They remained in weddings, funerals, garden parties, and mourning attire. They became symbolic rather than practical, evoking a past era of gentility, even as society modernized around them. But beneath this fading elegance, something new was stirring. The parasol, once a tool of exclusion, would soon be repurposed quietly, then loudly as a symbol of protest, defense, and even defiance. So how did the umbrella and its fading cousin, the parasol, find new life in the hands of suffragettes, demonstrators, and the working class? When did it stop shielding status and start shielding resistance? By the end of the 19th century, the parasol, once the icon of upper-class feminine leisure, had largely become a decorative echo, outpaced by the rising utility of the modern umbrella. But as parasols faded into fashion history, the umbrella was being quietly repurposed. No longer merely a defense against weather, the umbrella became something more complicated, more adaptable. It could be a tool of modesty, a badge of respectability, a weapon, or under the right circumstances, a statement of protest. The suffragette umbrella. As women in Britain and beyond pushed for political rights, they found themselves in hostile public spaces, city streets, rallies, marches, police lines. An umbrella, once a symbol of docility and refinement, became instead a shield, practical and symbolic. In the early 20th century, suffragettes marching through London or Edinburgh often carried umbrellas, especially in poor weather. While these were usually plain black and utilitarian, nothing like the frilly parasols of earlier decades, they served dual purposes. For one, they preserved dignity. A soaked or disheveled appearance could be used by critics to discredit female campaigners. But umbrellas also allowed women to maintain a presence in public that was both visible and controlled, self-contained, dignified and dry. More interestingly, the umbrella could become a defensive object. During arrests and assaults, suffragettes sometimes used umbrellas to fend off police or hostile crowds. Reports from newspapers of the time describe umbrellas thrust forward, in moments of chaos pushing back, obstructing, shielding. These were not formal weapons, but neither were they neutral. The same object that once marked a woman as passive now granted her presence a small circle of physical autonomy in a space that often denied her that right. Umbrellas and urban respectability. As the 20th century continued, the umbrella became increasingly associated with urban decorum, especially in Britain. For the emerging middle class, owning and carrying an umbrella was a subtle performance of self-respect and control. A man who carried an umbrella was prepared. He had a job, perhaps an office, perhaps a routine. A woman with an umbrella could walk without appearing idle. It signaled purpose. Even in the colonial territories of the British Empire, the umbrella was exported as a symbol of civilization. Colonial officers and missionaries brought umbrellas into climates where sun and rain were constant companions, and where local customs already had their own forms of portable shelter. In these contexts, the umbrella was often less about practicality than about presence, a visible signifier of Britishness, of order, of modernity. It wasn't long before the umbrella became standard in military and diplomatic dress codes. Officers in civilian uniform carried umbrellas with tightly rolled canopies and curved wooden handles. Even today, certain military handbooks define umbrella etiquette down to the precise angle it should be held while walking. Umbrellas in class satire. While the umbrella gained respectability, it also became a subject of satire, particularly in British culture. Caricatures from the 1920s and 30s often portrayed the fussy bureaucrat or overcautious civil servant with an umbrella tucked under one arm. The umbrella man became a stock character, cautious, polite, middle-class, slightly absurd. The British city gent, complete with bowler hat, umbrella and briefcase, emerged in cartoons and film. The umbrella here was not revolutionary. It was predictable, even mockable. It represented conformity, restraint, and the modest aspirations of the respectable commuter. In E.M. Forster's A Room with a View, umbrellas are used to signal a kind of emotional repression, symbolic of characters trying and failing to shield themselves from more elemental forces. But if the umbrella represented safety and conformity, that very symbolism made it ripe for subversion. Umbrella as protest tool, the civil rights era. By the 1950s and 60s, As civil rights movements gained momentum in the United States and elsewhere, the umbrella re-emerged this time not as a symbol of class, but of prepared resistance. In marches across the American South, umbrellas were carried by both black and white protesters not only to shield from the relentless sun, but to signal dignity. Marchers wore their best clothes, polished shoes, hats, and often carried umbrellas. The idea was clear: show the world that protesters were not unruly mobs, but citizens who cared about their appearance and their right to occupy public space. Umbrellas, in this context, played a subtle but effective role, quietly reinforcing the message of order, pride, and presence. It's worth noting that even when they weren't used defensively, umbrellas changed the shape of the protest. They made lines wider. They created a sea of round silhouettes that looked unified from above. They signaled permanence, a group that was not going to scatter just because of sun or rain. In this way, the umbrella once again became a barrier not between the sun and the skin, but between vulnerability and visibility. The gendered umbrella. Despite these uses, the umbrella still carried gendered associations. Throughout the mid-20th century, women's umbrellas were often smaller, more colorful, more delicate, seen as accessories rather than equipment. Men's umbrellas were larger, darker, businesslike. And while these trends have softened in recent years, they continue to shape expectations about who carries what and how. A woman's umbrella was not supposed to block a view. A man's umbrella was not supposed to fold too small. Children's umbrellas were made whimsical. Working-class umbrellas were plastic and transparent. Upper-class umbrellas were engraved. Even something as mundane as a weather tool was quietly reinforcing social structure. But all of this was about to change. Because in the coming decades, the umbrella would no longer be just a prop or shield. It would become a symbol of mass resistance, an icon not of passivity, but of protest. So how did the umbrella leap from the arms of middle-class commuters to the front lines of modern demonstrations? How did it become a banner, a barricade, and a symbol of revolution? By the late 20th century, the umbrella had become a fixture of urban life, folded, forgotten, left on buses and train seats, part of the scenery. It was rarely noticed, and when it was often treated as a background object. But like many mundane things in history, its potential lay dormant, quiet until needed. And then, it reemerged not in the drawing rooms of London, but on the rain-slicked streets of protest movements, where umbrellas were lifted not as protection from weather or sun, but from something much more volatile: violence. The Umbrella Revolution. In 2014, the streets of Hong Kong erupted in protest. Thousands of pro-democracy demonstrators filled public squares to demand open elections and resist Beijing's increasing influence over Hong Kong's internal politics. And amid tear gas, pepper spray, and batons, one image stood out: umbrellas raised high against riot police. The umbrella movement was born. At first, the umbrella was simply practical. When police began using pepper spray and tear gas, protesters, many of them students, used umbrellas to shield their faces. Cheap, common, and easily distributed, umbrellas offered an immediate physical barrier against the state. But the image resonated deeply. Here was a tool of daily life, turned into a symbol of resistance. Something so ordinary it passed through checkpoints and went unnoticed until it was turned upward, until it was used to protect, to organize, and to stand ground. Quickly, umbrellas became tactical instruments. Protesters used them not only to shield from spray and cameras, but to obscure identities, form walls, and signal solidarity. In many images from 2014, umbrellas appear in every color, size, and shape, transforming crowds into a kind of moving canopy. The symbol stuck. Protesters painted umbrellas with slogans, used them as flags, and held them high not just against rain but against surveillance, authoritarianism, and erasure. The umbrella had become something else entirely. Not passive, not decorative, not even neutral. It had become defiant. The history behind the gesture. Why did the umbrella strike such a chord in both Hong Kong and the watching world? Part of its power lay in contrast. Umbrellas are not aggressive objects. They are peaceful. They suggest weather, not war. When police in full armor confront civilians holding umbrellas, the imbalance is visually stark. But there's a deeper echo here, a through line that connects the umbrella's long, often forgotten, symbolism. In the 18th century, it was a sign of status. In the 19th, it was a mark of propriety and order. In the 20th, it was a staple of respectable commuting. And in the 21st, it was reimagined as a collective shield. All these meanings, quietly layered over time, gave the umbrella an emotional charge. It was and remains an object of controlled space, a shelter, a defense, a boundary. In protest, these meanings were reclaimed. Other umbrella movements. Since 2014, umbrellas have appeared in protests across the globe. In Myanmar, during demonstrations against the military junta, umbrellas shielded protesters from surveillance drones. In Thailand, umbrellas were again used to block tear gas and identify peaceful marchers. In Belarus, in Chile, in Poland, umbrellas continue to appear held overhead not just for weather, but for symbolic visibility. In the U.S., following the murder of George Floyd in 2020, umbrellas became common in protests as part of ad hoc barricades. Protesters formed umbrella lines, reminiscent of phalanx formations, low-tech shields against rubber bullets, surveillance, and pepper spray. And even more subtly, umbrellas have taken on aesthetic roles in protest. Photographs of brightly colored umbrellas dotting dark, crowded streets capture the eye and invite media coverage. Their visibility helps ensure that what is happening beneath them cannot be ignored. The language of objects. It's easy to forget how powerful ordinary things can become. But the umbrella, simple, portable, private, has always spoken quietly about power, protection, and presence. When held above the head of a queen, it conferred dignity. When carried in the rain by a servant, it declared hierarchy. When opened by a woman alone in the street, it asked for space. When raised in the face of a baton, it said, "No more." That is the strange legacy of the umbrella. A tool of quiet control that became, in time, a tool of quiet rebellion. And perhaps that is its most enduring message. That even the most mundane object can become profound if held at the right angle, at the right moment, by the right hand. Story 7. The Railway and the Reticule, How Travel Changed Handbag History. Imagine you're a woman in 1805. You've dressed for a social visit or perhaps a stroll through a public garden. Your gown is high-waisted, in the Empire style, with flowing muslin skirts and short sleeves. And slung delicately over your wrist is a small, embroidered pouch tied with a ribbon, a reticule. This tiny bag holds perhaps a handkerchief, a coin or two, a vinaigrette, or a note. It is just enough to carry what you need for a polite afternoon, not more. Because at this point in time, women are not expected to carry much, certainly not on their person. The world, after all, is supposed to come to them, not the other way around. But all of that is about to change. Because the 19th century brought with it something that fundamentally reshaped how people moved through the world, the railway. And with this great movement came a shift in one of the most quietly revealing objects in a woman's life, her bag. The reticule, elegance over function. Before the age of travel, the reticule was the dominant form of female personal carry. Originating in the late 18th century as dresses became lighter and slimmer, the tie-on pockets once hidden under full skirts vanished. In their place came the reticule, from the Latin reticulum, meaning little net. It was often made of silk, velvet, or crocheted fabric, and could be decorated with beads, embroidery, or tassels. Reticules were small because they were meant to be. Women were not expected to carry money, documents, or tools. They didn't need to. Their lives were generally organized around homes, salons, and chaperoned social spaces. What little they did carry was assumed to be light, decorative, and non-essential. But the world was expanding, quite literally, beneath their feet. The railway arrives. The first public railway, the Stockton and Darlington Railway, opened in 1825. By the 1830s and 1840s, railway networks were spreading rapidly across Britain and Europe. Cities once days apart were now reachable in hours. Trains brought speed, unpredictability, and exposure to public space. And this presented a new problem. What was a woman to carry when she traveled? Suddenly, women were not just strolling in gardens. They were boarding trains, traveling alone or with companions, entering public waiting rooms, ticket halls, platforms, and needing to manage tickets, handkerchiefs, coins, calling cards, snacks, and even reading material. The reticule, elegant as it was, could no longer keep up. Public space and personal storage. Unlike men, who had long had pockets in coats and trousers, women's clothing continued to lack built-in compartments. This left them entirely reliant on handbags for everything they needed in public. The emergence of larger carry items in the mid-19th century, such as carpet bags, satchels, and Gladstone bags, reflected a growing need. Travel was no longer a male domain. Middle and upper-class women began to journey on their own for shopping, visiting relatives, even attending university lectures or exhibitions. But while men's luggage was often carried by porters, women's bags were expected to remain with them on their laps, in their compartments, or at their feet. This made the handbag a constant companion, and with that came a need for both practicality and discretion. Unlike the reticule, these bags had structure. They often featured internal compartments, clasps, reinforced handles, and locking mechanisms. They were not just soft pouches, they were containers of personal agency. The bag as a threshold object. This shift in bag design marked something deeper than convenience. It signaled a change in how women navigated space. A woman with a structured handbag crossed thresholds from private to public, domestic to industrial. Her bag was the thing she held onto as she moved through ticket counters, through crowds, into train cars and cabs. It held not only her belongings but her confidence, her preparation, her right to be there. But this new mobility also invited scrutiny. Some critics viewed handbags as vulgar, too large, too masculine, too visible. There were debates in women's magazines over what a woman should and should not carry. Should she handle her own money? Should she keep a notebook? What about smelling salts? A book? The handbag, once a decorative afterthought, had become a site of judgment. Fashion follows function reluctantly. Despite the demands of daily life and travel, fashion was slow to accommodate the growing utility of women's bags. In many period illustrations, even in the 1850s and 60s, women still carry small purses often looped over a wrist or dangling by a finger. Large bags, if depicted, are shown resting by their feet, held by a porter, or hidden behind skirts. But in reality, the line between handbag and luggage was blurring. Women began carrying medium-sized leather or cloth bags with reinforced sides and snap closures, sometimes adapted from men's doctor's bags or travel cases. These weren't always fashionable, but they were functional, and their owners came to rely on them. As train travel grew safer and more common for women of all classes, the bag became a quiet symbol of independence. It said, "I am going somewhere. I am carrying what I need. I do not need to ask for it." But what about security? How did women protect their growing autonomy as they navigated busy train stations and crowded compartments? And how did the bag evolve in response to this new vulnerability? It's 1873 and you are a woman boarding a train at King's Cross. You've purchased your ticket, your gloves are on, and tucked in your arm is a carpet bag, a serviceable leather-trimmed holdall with metal clasps. Inside, your money purse, a notebook, train biscuits, a hairbrush, and possibly, depending on your station in society, a revolver. Because by now, the handbag is no longer just a fashion statement or accessory. It is a practical extension of the woman herself. And as mobility increases, so too does the need to protect what one carries. In this era of industrialized travel and blurred public-private boundaries, the handbag becomes a vessel of ownership, identity, and, increasingly, safety. The problem of purse theft in privacy. As trains grew faster and more crowded, women became increasingly aware that they were not alone in public spaces. Their belongings, once held in secure homes or supervised salons, now traveled with them through busy compartments and shared platforms. Theft became common. Newspapers from the 1860s onward reported a growing trend in handbag snatching, especially at train stations, theaters, and open-air markets. With the rise of railway commuting came a new breed of opportunistic criminals, pickpockets and so-called bagmen, who operated in public spaces. Victorian etiquette books began to caution women about leaving bags unattended or carrying them too loosely. Advice included: keep your bag on your lap during travel. Do not trust station porters with personal carry items. Use locks or hidden compartments to protect valuables. In response, handbag makers began to advertise security features: spring clasp locks, hidden flaps, false bottoms, even tiny keyed mechanisms for upper-class customers. The bag was becoming not only a storage solution, but a portable vault. The bag as a symbol of identity. Beyond theft, the growing size and complexity of handbags sparked a new kind of cultural scrutiny: the idea that a woman's handbag reflected her entire self. Writers and illustrators in the 1880s and 90s often mocked the expanding contents of women's bags. Cartoons showed handbags bursting with everything from smelling salts to sandwiches. Satirists joked that women carried their whole households with them, that their bags had become portable pantries or bottomless pits. But beneath the satire lay a truth. The handbag was now a personal archive. A woman's schedule, finances, hygiene, and reading habits could all be gleaned from its contents. And more than that, it signaled independence. In previous generations, a man might carry his coin purse, monocle, and pocket watch each in its own compartment or tailored jacket. But a woman now carried her identity consolidated into a single item. One bag, all hers. And that, in its own quiet way, was revolutionary. The intersection of fashion and mobility. Fashion responded somewhat reluctantly to this shift. By the 1880s, handbags had grown in size, material diversity, and social acceptability. They were no longer just tied with ribbons or carried daintily by hand. Straps, shoulder loops, and metal frames became common. Bags could now be slung over the arm, hung from the wrist, gripped by reinforced leather handles. Materials ranged from Moroccan leather to canvas, beaded velvet, or carpet remnants. Middle-class women opted for practical satchels. Upper-class ladies might own several bags, some travel-ready, others designed for outings, and still others purely decorative. Fashion houses began to take notice. In Paris, designers like Hermes, originally a saddlery and harness workshop, would soon shift toward luxury bags. In Britain, firms like Esprit began offering fine leather goods to women with taste and means. Still, the line between respectable handbag and suspicious bulk was carefully policed. Women were often warned not to carry too large a bag, lest they seem overly ambitious or unnaturally prepared. Some etiquette experts suggested that men found large handbags unfeminine and unsettling. Yet women pressed forward, bag in hand, because by now, travel was no longer a novelty. It was part of modern life, and the handbag had become an essential companion, a mark of readiness in a world of flux. The handbag and the new woman. The closing decades of the 19th century gave rise to the new woman, educated, politically conscious, mobile, and often unwed. She read newspapers, she worked, she walked the city streets, and she did so, crucially, with a bag of her own. Some women carried canvas satchels to lectures or political meetings. Others tucked notebooks, letters, or pamphlets into their handbags as they canvassed for suffrage or reform. Photographs from suffrage marches in the early 1900s often show women holding signs in one hand and small bags in the other. The bag, again, is both practical and symbolic. It holds what she needs. It shows that she is prepared to act. It is a declaration of autonomy, quiet but absolute. And it begs the question, what then lay inside the modern woman's handbag? What tools, secrets, and stories were being carried across borders, into cities, and toward a changing century? By the dawn of the 20th century, trains had become the arteries of the modern world. But more than goods or news or factory-made clothing, they were carrying something else entirely: autonomous women. And alongside them always was the handbag. What began as a delicate wrist pouch, the reticule, had evolved into an item of function, then fashion, and now something even more complex, a symbol of identity, movement, and choice. As travel expanded, as women entered workplaces and universities, as borders shifted and war broke out across Europe, the handbag came into its own. It became a silent but constant companion through history. War and the working woman. During World War I, women across Britain, France, Germany, and the U.S. entered industries previously closed to them. Munitions factories, civil service, rail work, even auxiliary roles near the front lines. For the first time in modern history, large numbers of women commuted independently to jobs. And with them came their bags. Utility became the dominant concern. Large handbags, satchels, and shoulder-strapped holdalls were needed to carry ration cards, gas masks, identification papers, wages, personal items like cigarettes, handkerchiefs, or soap. Designers responded with sturdier bags, simple, boxy, no-nonsense. Gone were silk tassels and embroidery. In their place, leather, canvas, snaps, and zippers. In some countries, especially during periods of rationing, women even sewed their own bags. Instructions for war bags appeared in homemaking magazines, detailing how to create practical designs using leftover upholstery fabric, old coats, or blackout curtain material. The handbag had officially joined the war effort. The interwar years and the rise of design. After the war, something interesting happened. As women gained the vote in Britain 1918 and the U.S. 1920, the handbag began to shift again, not just in function, but in status. Women now expected to move through public space, voting booths, offices, lecture halls, train stations. Their bags reflected this new confidence. In the 1920s, handbag shapes became more varied and architectural. Art Deco styling gave rise to metal frames, geometric shapes, and elegant clasps. Purses no longer had to disappear into the folds of clothing. They became visible, deliberate parts of the outfit. Luxury brands began to emerge. Hermes, Louis Vuitton, and Gucci transitioned from luggage to ladies' handbags. Chanel introduced her iconic 2.55 handbag in 1955, with a shoulder strap so women could keep their hands free, radical at the time. Leatherworkers and artisans created doctor bags, pochettes, day bags, and evening clutches for the new mobile woman. Yet for all the glamour, handbags continued to be scrutinized. A bag too large, unfeminine. Too small, frivolous. Too expensive, vain. Too cheap, unrefined. The cultural commentary was relentless. A woman's handbag, much like her shoes or voice, was often judged more harshly than its contents deserved. Still, the bag remained her own. The bag as private space in a public world. By the mid-20th century, as air travel replaced railways and urban life became more dense, handbags assumed an even deeper cultural role. They became portable sanctuaries. Inside a woman's handbag might be keys to her own flat, birth control pills, employment records, letters, lipstick, a book she wasn't supposed to be reading, a cigarette lighter, cash. No longer merely decorative or even protective, the handbag became self-contained proof of a life lived outside the home. In psychoanalysis and literature, the handbag took on symbolic weight representing selfhood, boundaries, even sexuality. Novels of the 1950s and 60s often noted what women kept in their bags, sometimes with fascination, sometimes with anxiety. The bag became a place where what was hidden met what was allowed. The contemporary bag, fashion, function, and feminism. In recent decades, the handbag has continued to evolve, both materially and metaphorically. Backpacks and crossbody bags are favored by students and commuters. Tote bags became cultural shorthand for bookstores, environmentalism, and urban chic. Designer bags became financial investment symbols of class and taste, often indistinguishable from speculative commodities. Clear bags required at concerts, stadiums, and airports invited a new kind of anxiety, visibility without privacy. Fanny packs and belt bags returned, rebranded as minimalist and gender-neutral. Smart bags and anti-theft tech infused function with futurism. And yet, even now, most women's clothing still lacks usable pockets. So the bag endures not because women are inclined toward accessories, but because, even in the 21st century, they are not afforded the same basic storage space as men. The handbag remains necessary, and that necessity remains deeply revealing. A quiet revolution on the wrist. The transformation of the handbag from a delicate wrist pouch in the 1790s to a crossbody bag on the streets of Seoul or Sao Paulo today mirrors the journey of modern womanhood. From domestic sphere to public platform, from decoration to purpose, from dependency to autonomy. It is a revolution few notice. And yet, every time someone slings a strap over their shoulder and walks into the world, carrying what they need, they are engaging with a legacy centuries in the making. Because the history of the handbag is not about fashion. It is about movement, about the right to carry what's yours, to go where you please, and to keep your hands free while you do it.